The courtroom hums with restless energy, the sort that coils and braces before a storm. Packed rows of onlookers lean forward, faces etched with curiosity and a subtle hunger for the unfolding drama. The defendant, Officer Mark Brennan, sits stoically at the defense table. His square jaw tightens, his posture rigid, military-like, but his eyes dart occasionally toward the gallery that ripples with murmured speculation. He feels the weight of every gaze, every whispered suspicion of guilt, and it hangs over him like a suffocating shroud. Screens flicker, displaying the grainy but damning footage. His baton striking Anthony Grayson, an unarmed black man. The room erupts occasionally, gasps peppering the tense silence each time the violent moment loops on replay. The prosecution's case is hinged on this unassailable piece of evidence, and everyone knows it. No spin, no context, no crafted defense seems capable of unmaking what is now etched into their collective memory: a cop's assault on a citizen he was meant to protect. Presiding over the chaos is Judge Eleanor Vasquez, her gavel pounding the air with sharp cracks of authority. "Order in this court," she demands, her voice cutting through the growing cacophony. Her eyes dart toward Mark Brennan, a fleeting moment of something unreadable passing over her stern face. Sympathy? Contempt? Even she doesn't know. The prosecution begins to lay out its narrative. "Ladies and gentlemen," the lead prosecutor, Sarah Holden, declares, her voice steady and resolute, "what you are about to witness is not merely misconduct. It's an affront to justice, to human dignity, and to the very fabric of equality that should bind our society." Officer Brennan wielded his authority not as protector, but as predator. Brennan squirms under the barrage of pointed words. His lawyer, Arthur Mackenzie, whispers something fiercely in his ear, but Mark can barely register it. His mind is a cloud, a tumult of conflicting emotions. He replays the incident in his head, not to find the truth, but to re-examine the angles, to remember a moment where he might explain or justify his actions. He finds no comfort there. The gallery shifts, a rhythm of disbelieving shakes of heads and narrowed eyes. On the opposite side, colleagues from the force sit in stiff solidarity, their eyes a mix of loyalty and unspoken uncertainty. Among them is Frank Mills, Mark's former partner, his face like stone but betraying a flicker of pity. Yet even those who wear the badge sit limply under the damning weight of the evidence. A line has been crossed, and loyalty is a fragile thread here. Suddenly, the courtroom doors creak open, swinging wide to reveal a striking young woman. Heads swivel as gasps ripple audibly through the crowd. She strides forward with the commanding presence of someone used to authority. Her frame athletic but poised, her gaze penetrating. The iconic navy blue FBI jacket she wears transforms the room's energy entirely, stealing the focus from the footage that had, moments ago, seemed like the gravest possible center of attention. Mark Brennan's eyes widen in disbelief and something deeper fear? Pride? Guilt? As he recognizes her. This is his daughter, Elena Brennan, fresh out of Quantico and already establishing herself in the bureau as a rising star. What the hell is she doing here? "Agents don't just waltz into courthouses unannounced," Judge Vasquez snaps, attempting to regain control of the narrative. "State your business, young lady." Despite herself, the judge's curiosity flickers. This isn't a routine disruption. Elena doesn't falter. "Your Honor," she begins, her voice unwavering but laced with urgency. "I have reason to believe this case has larger implications that may necessitate federal oversight." Mark feels the ground beneath him tilt, as if reality were sliding out of focus. He expected public scrutiny, relentless media attention, perhaps even personal disgrace, but Elena? His pride? His brilliant, principled daughter? That's a variable he hadn't anticipated. "What sort of implications?" Vasquez demands, her eyes narrowing, scanning Elena for signs of bluff or bravado. "Corruption," Elena responds, her voice cutting through the building whispers. "Not just by the defendant, but possibly reaching far beyond this courtroom. There's a pattern. This incident may only be the tip of a much larger iceberg." The room's collective breath is sucked inward. Cameras click furiously. Reporters scribble notes. Elena's revelation reframes the entire trial, elevating it from a singular act of misconduct to the shadowy workings of systemic wrongs that reach unseen tentacles into law enforcement. But Elena's declaration does something else. It directly pits her against her own father, symbolically and emotionally. Will she tarnish her father's reputation further in pursuit of justice, Or is this some twisted attempt to save face under the guise of investigation? The questions swirl, unanswered, as another silence drenches the room. Mark tries to meet her gaze, but she avoids it, focusing purposefully on the judge. To Mark, that nonverbal evasion stabs deeper than any words ever could. He knows Elena well enough to see in every movement that she's not grandstanding. She's serious, and whatever she's discovered won't just complicate his trial, it might annihilate what remains of their fragile bond. The judge, clearly torn between protocol and intrigue, deliberates for an uncomfortably long moment before sighing heavily. "Agent Brennan," she says, emphasizing the name like a subtle reminder of the conflict of interest hanging precariously in the air, "I'll allow a brief recess to hear what you have to say. Be prepared with evidence. This trial is not your political platform to make unfounded accusations." As Vasquez strikes her gavel and the courtroom begins to shuffle uncertainly toward a break, Elena turns briefly toward the gallery. Her eyes land firmly on Mark for the first time, and for a fleeting second, the world narrows. Their shared history, their fractured relationship, surges wordlessly between them. Mark lifts a hand slightly, an instinctive, almost pleading gesture. But Elena spares no return acknowledgement, pivoting sharply and disappearing through a side door with purposeful strides. With every step she takes away from him, Mark's world seems to unravel further. He sinks into his chair, rubbing the bridge of his nose with a trembling hand. The whispers of speculation cascade around him. What could she have learned? Could her pursuit of justice lay bare not only his professional sins, but personal ones as well? Mark imagines the skeletons in his closet rattling to attention in the shadows of his mind. Secret prejudices, poor decisions, failures as a father, a husband, a man. Down the hall, Elena enters a starkly lit room where a lone FBI agent, older, grizzled, and carrying an air of tired wisdom, waits for her. "You really think they're ready for this?" he asks, tossing a dossier thick enough to shock upon the table. "They have to be," Elena replies without hesitation, but her tone betrays weariness. "This trial, this moment, it could be a flashpoint. It could force real change. Or it could backfire spectacularly," the older agent counters, folding his arms. "Your old man might go down, but so could a lot more people. That doesn't always end with the public cheering. Are you ready for the fallout, kid?" Elena locks eyes with her mentor, her jaw tightening. "The truth doesn't care about fallout." He chuckles dryly, shaking his head. "You really are your father's daughter, in ways you don't even see, are you?" She doesn't respond, turning her attention instead to the scattered documents inside the folder. Maps, transaction histories, internal memos marked confidential. A labyrinth of connections that suggest a broader conspiracy within the police force. The threads, while still tenuous, all seem to wind their way back to the same point of origin. Mark Brennan. Back in the courtroom, the tension bubbles over like a boiling cauldron. Questions hang in the air, unanswered, while reporters whisper about Elena's bombshell. Is she a savior? A traitor? The hero the system needs, or the Judas her father fears? When she re-enters the courtroom, the whispers reach a crescendo, but quickly fade as everyone senses the gravitas she carries now. She proceeds to the stand, breathing deeply once, steeling herself for what's to come. "Agent Brennan," Judge Vasquez begins, "this court granted you this time at great expense to both procedure and public trust. We are all waiting." Elena nods, stepping forward to place several sheets and photographs on display. "Your Honor, I have evidence suggesting that this incident is part of a deliberate and calculated effort. It's not just about my father, it's about something far worse." Before she can continue, a voice from the gallery erupts, raw with anger, cutting through the tense air. "Lies! That's all this Isley's and cover-ups!" It's Anthony Grayson's mother, tears streaming down her face as her voice cracks. The bailiffs rush in to contain the outburst, but they don't need to. Her grief is as sharp and piercing as any shout could ever be. Elena stays frozen, meeting Mrs. Grayson's tortured gaze for a fraction of a second before turning back to Judge Vasquez. Her face betrays a flicker of second-guessing, a subtle but visible crack in her steel armor. "Order in the courtroom," the judge demands once more, her voice slightly hoarse from the strain of reigning in the chaos. Mark Brennan's head remains lowered as Elena carries on. His daughter's words loom like an approaching storm warning that promises not justice, but an avalanche that may condemn far more than just him. As she takes a deep breath, preparing to disclose the first seismic revelation, the courtroom's main doors swing open once more. This time, it's not a young FBI agent who enters. This time, it's two men in suits, unmarked badges clipped to their belts. Their stone-carved faces reveal nothing, but their presence shatters Elena's composure faintly. "Elena Brennan?" the taller agent calls, his tone cold as iron. "Step outside with us, now!" The courtroom plunges into hushed disorder, questions flying without answers as Elena hesitates, torn between duty and a rapidly manifesting fear. Recap. Tensions rise as damning footage and Elena Brennan's shocking allegations reframe the trial. But just as she prepares to reveal a startling conspiracy, unwelcome intruders shatter her momentum, leaving the courtroom and Heron edge. The courtroom murmurs fade to an eerie silence as the two dark-suited agents close the heavy wooden doors behind them. The echo reverberates like a judge's gavel, but neither man speaks at first. The taller of the two, his face chiseled into a mask of inscrutability, steps forward with deliberate slowness. Elena's chest rises and falls in controlled breaths, though the tension around her eyes betrays inner turmoil. She stands straighter, refusing to shrink under their cold scrutiny. "Elena Brennan?" the taller agent repeats, his intonation almost identical to his first command, yet sharper now. The way he emphasizes her last name makes the blood drain from Mark Brennan's face. He shifts restlessly in his seat but remains silent. "Yes?" Elena replies tersely, her voice controlled but slightly strained. "What's the meaning of this?" "We're in the middle of a court proceeding." The shorter agent, stockier with a perpetual scowl etched into his face, steps sideways to flank Elena's line of sight. "You need to come with us, now. This isn't a request." Judge Vasquez intervenes swiftly, her authority slicing through the gathering uncertainty like a blade. "Agents," she begins, her tone sharp but calm, "this is my courtroom. If you have business, you'll state its relevance and present credentials. Otherwise, you'll allow these proceedings to continue undisturbed." The taller man raises a hand, palm outward, signaling a temporary halt to the judge's ire. He gestures toward his belt, displaying his badge. "Special Agent in Charge, Matthew Royce, FBI. This concerns an ongoing federal investigation directly tied to this trial. We cannot delay." A ripple of shock washes over the courtroom, punctuated by faint gasps and scribbling pens. Elena narrows her eyes. "What investigation?" she demands, her voice slicing through the din. Her position as the herald of a supposed conspiracy now seems precariously usurped. Mark Brennan lifts his gaze, his wide eyes darting between Elena and the two agents. His fingers tighten on the edge of the defense table, the white knuckles betraying the storm building within. "Agent Brennan," Royce continues, his tone flat yet commanding, "step outside. Confidential details are not a matter for an open courtroom." Elena doesn't flinch. Instead, she takes half a step back and squares her shoulders. "Not until you explain yourself. I've already presented the framework of my case to the court. If there's overlap, that's no reason to disrupt. If anything, it reinforces the need for transparency." Her words ring with conviction, but Royce's steel-gray eyes remain unyielding. "Agent Brennan," Royce's voice drops, quieter but more menacing, his composure like a coiled snake. "You're treading on delicate ground. We've tolerated your involvement so far, but any further interference could compromise months of investigative groundwork. This," he waves a hand vaguely at the courtroom, "is not the time or the place." A brittle silence ensues, broken only by the heavy breath of Judge Vasquez. "Enough," she snaps, her tone brooking no argument. Her gavel strikes with an audible crack. "Special Agent Royce, unless your actions pertain directly to evidence admissible here, my courtroom is not your jurisdiction. That said, Agent Brennan, I strongly suggest you evaluate your standing in this matter. If federal interference exists, disclose it now." Elena lifts her chin, defiance flickering in her gaze even as the weight of the room bears down on her. But before she can respond, Royce's lips curl into a smirk devoid of humor. "Perhaps we've all forgotten who she is," he murmurs, loud enough to be heard but soft enough to sting. His eyes pierce Elena's. Agent Brennan yields two inherent conflicts of interest. Mark Brennan is her father. But here's the more pressing point. Every piece of evidence she's offering, it's circumstantial and sourced from a secondary informant under sealed bureau records. "We've traced a leak, Your Honor, and it leads here." The accusation strikes the courtroom like a thunderclap. Gasps erupt, cascading whispers folding into shouts of disbelief and confusion. Anthony Grayson's mother rises again, her voice a wail of anguish. "How many lies are we supposed to take?" Security ushers her out as pandemonium brews. Elena freezes, her calculated demeanor cracking momentarily. "That's absurd," she shoots back, her voice rising in fervent defense. "I obtained my evidence through channels designated for federal review. Nothing I've provided violates protocol, and I am not the source of any leak." Special Agent Royce takes one precise step closer to her, his frame now looming over her visibly smaller stature, though her resolve doesn't falter. "Intentional or otherwise, you've stirred a hornet's nest. You don't understand half the implications of the connections you've exposed. Pull the wrong thread and the system collapses." The implications send an almost electric current through the observer gallery, shifting uneasily in their seats. Even Judge Vasquez seems momentarily uncertain, her fingers tapping rhythmically against the wood of her bench. "Agent Royce," she interjects at last, a faint hardening in her tone, "this is not the place to draw conclusions over alleged leaks or worse. Prepare your tangible concerns in writing before disrupting this court again." Royce doesn't back down, but he nods, the gesture more out of respect for protocol than agreement. "As you wish, Your Honor, but I'll warn you all here and now. There are consequences, wide-reaching, permanent consequences for mishandling this case. And some players in this game," his eyes flick briefly toward Mark Brennan before meeting Elena's again, "are already more entangled than you know." With that cryptic send-off, Royce turns on his heel, motioning for his partner to follow him. The door closes with a resounding noise that feels like a gunshot echoing through the court's shell-shocked silence. Mark exhales audibly, sweat glistening at his temple. He looks at Elena for answers, but her focus remains fixated on her tightly clasped hands. Judge Vasquez exhales slowly. "Agent Brennan, the clock is ticking. This court does not appreciate theatrics, nor will I tolerate further delays. Present your evidence, or I'll consider Special Agent Royce's words heavily in my ruling." "Understood?" Spurred into urgency, Elena steps forward, hands steady despite the whirlwind around her. She proceeds calmly, laying out the papers, photographs, and charts that paint a web of connections rooted in corruption. "Your Honor," she begins carefully, "this goes beyond a singular act of misconduct. What happened to Anthony Grayson wasn't isolated. It's part of a culture, a system. And the dots," she taps firmly at highlighted points on her printed evidence, "connect here." Her finger lands squarely on a precinct-coded financial transaction log, multiple unexplained deposits, suspicious timestamps, hands dirty up the chain. A charged stillness fills the courtroom, broken by murmurs of the gallery taking in each twist. Even Anthony's remaining family, still visibly reeling, watches with intensity. Finally, the judge leans forward slightly, eyes scanning Elena. "And why now, Agent Brennan? Why present this here and not through the Bureau? If this conspiracy runs so deep, why walk into a trial and overturn every piece of protocol your agency prides itself on?" Elena pauses, the formidable agent suddenly seeming almost vulnerable in hesitation. When she speaks, her voice is lower. "Because, Your Honor, I believe we've delayed long enough. Justice is survival. Improper or not, I refuse to stall one more investigation to gather dust before hands tied by bureaucracy." The judge regards her with a measured look as the floor opens for closing remarks. Mark Brennan, however, feels every second stretch immeasurably longer, watching helplessly as truths entangle his name deeper. Watching as his daughter balances duty against inevitable fallout, both professionally and as family. Before anyone speaks, another commotion shifts to the gallery's entry. Mark spots Frank Mills, former partner turned witness by legal compulsion, exiting briefly as whispers circulate. The court pauses again, not just procedural, but an emotional storm brewing yet unspoken. Recap. Agent Royce confronts Elena, accusing her actions of jeopardizing an unnamed intricate investigation. Amid doubts and looming consequences, she finally lays evidence alleging systemic corruption cemented deep in precinct financials. The courtroom remains charged with a volatile energy, each thread of tension tightening as every second stretches longer than the last. Judge Vasquez sits taller in her chair, visibly exasperated but suppressing it beneath a steadfast professionalism. Her sharp eyes scan the faces in the gallery, seeing the fear, doubt, and fiery curiosity radiating from the onlookers. Whispers rise and fall like ocean waves. Elena returns to the stand, laying out her evidence with meticulous precision. Even as her hands remain steady, her chest visibly rises and falls with deliberate, focused breaths. The eyes that once admired her from Quantico evaluations or across bureau ranks now rake her with scrutiny. Her career, her integrity is firmly on the line here. Mark Brennan can barely keep his hands from trembling as he shifts nervously in his seat. His gaze flits between Elena and the photographs she is presenting, as though trying to piece together the collapse of his world in real time. This data clearly shows an unusual influx of funds into accounts tied to Precinct K42, my father's precinct, Elena begins. Her voice, though commanding as always, carries a slight strain. Her effort to rein in her emotions is admirable, but it does not go unnoticed. We are talking about structured deposits, amounts specifically broken down to avoid triggering red flag thresholds on financial oversight systems. This is no accident, it's calculated. It paints the picture of systemic corruption tied to officers sworn to serve and protect. The gallery breaks into more murmurs, waves of disbelief clashing against reluctant acknowledgement. Even among the rows of uniformed officers seated to support Mark, there's visible discomfort. The evidence doesn't just expose a failing system, it threatens to consume anyone complacent enough to let it thrive. Then, with surgical precision, Elena unfurls the next piece of her presentation, official-looking documents stamped with the seal of the Bureau. This memo, she continues, her voice unwavering now, was flagged during an internal review 3 months ago. It outlines discrepancies linked to transfers of high-value narcotics scheduled for destruction, originating from a single precinct repository, Precinct K42, she says, deliberately reiterating the name like a hammer pounding a nail. Judge Vasquez leans forward, her expression impassive but intrigued. "And you're certain these findings remain uncontested?" she probes, her tone sharp enough to carve through the courtroom's simmering tension. Elena glances toward the decisive bulwark of Royce's earlier warning, feeling the weight of his accusations still lingering in the air like smoke after a gunshot. "As certain as I can be at present, Your Honor," she replies. The paper trail substantiates irregular activity. Still, beneath her composed delivery, fatigue gnaws at her resolve. It's Anthony Grayson's younger sister, seated near the middle of the gallery, whose piercing stare eventually draws a brief glance from Mark. She's no longer crying. Her hands grip her seat firmly, her knuckles white against dark, trembling skin. There's a quiet strength behind her desperate expression, one which unnerves him even more than the prosecutorial theatrics or Elena's mounting revelations. "So," Arthur Mackenzie interjects from the defense side, standing abruptly with the finesse of a legal vulture. His gray suit catches the artificial light above, gleaming slightly as he narrows his eyes at Elena. "Agent Brennan or Daughter Brennan, depending on how one chooses to separate roles, isn't it rather convenient that your analysis suddenly surfaces, hinging legalities and entire societal trust on circumstantial data? Isn't this about saving face?" Before Elena can respond, Mackenzie moves a step closer to the jury for maximum manipulation. "Because context matters, doesn't it, Agent Brennan? And isn't it worth acknowledging that most of what you've presented could just as easily be explained as clerical errors or unrelated cluster anomalies? After all, organizations are nuanced. Human oversight, no framework, especially the bureaus or precincts, claims perfection." Judge Vasquez slams her gavel twice, her irritation storming toward a boiling point. "Mr. Mackenzie, you will not devolve this trial into personal attacks. Remain on topic." Her blunt authority silences some whispers. Elena, standing firm, meets Mackenzie's insinuating tone with her own iron resolve. "If mismanaged funds consistently align to identical external pressures," she snaps back, "and you find deposit slips keeping pace across different branches under one precinct, then human oversight excuses start to crumble. Correlation becomes egregiously criminal. The trail is there, and my evidence substantiates its gravity before mere coincidence nullifies. You'd understand these complexities if dono he weight actually empirically per Protection Bureau Manual Escal, External Regulations, Review Case Volumes, Bridge thin, here judge. Stubborn prior, argue simpler truths, dismissed cleverly distracting. Mackenzie lie instances lax, Blavana fund ground theoretical absurd blown becomes detective new. Halfway thermdesk crossover, new 1003rd drafting collaborators, consistent suspension, Terriers/conspirator doubling, page head tightening, compels subtle previous familiar dense harsh. The courtroom air crackles with anticipation as Elena Brennan regains her composure, staring down the defense team and Judge Vasquez with a steady intensity. As she stands before the projection screen, her voice cuts sharply through the tension, every syllable deliberate and measured. This moment must land with precision. No wavering, no hint of doubt. "Your Honor," she repeats, louder to command the room's full attention, "everything I've brought today connects to a broader, more devastating reality. This isn't a coincidence. This isn't about misplaced decimal points or clerical errors. It's about people, those entrusted with the public's safety, operating beyond oversight and exploiting power for personal gain." Whispers ripple through the gallery again, an indecipherable cacophony of disbelief, approval, and outrage. On the back row, an older gentleman shakes his head slowly. Closer to the front, Anthony Grayson's younger sister grips her sweater sleeves, her young face aged by grief and gnawing determination. But before she can continue, a voice from the gallery interrupts, raw with accusation. "Spare me the speeches!" It's Anthony Grayson's older brother, lean and visibly trembling with fury. His outburst draws security forward, but he waves them off. "We don't need pie charts, Agent Brennan. We need justice for Anthony right now." Elena turns to face him briefly, her voice neither defensive nor condescending but firm. "And what I'm uncovering, Mr. Grayson, is what denied your brother the justice he deserved in the first place. If we don't address the system itself, we're just putting bandages on a broken limb." "You can't fix broken people," he roars back, but this time his voice cracks and he collapses into his chair as his family pulls him close. Elena exhales, pressing forward. Each piece of evidence follows a thread that collectively begins to unravel a network. She gestures to the charts, each projection emphasizing another layer of the conspiracy. "It goes without saying," she pauses briefly, ensuring her words land, "even relatives or professional allies of individuals in question are under scrutiny. Transparency demands no one gets a free pass, including me." A faint tremor betrays her iron facade, but it vanishes the moment the gallery fixates deeper on her revelations. From his seat, Mark Brennan keeps his head low, the edges of the defense table growing damp from his palms pressing against the wood. Each word out of his daughter's mouth is another nail, yet he can't decide whether they're for his coffin or for whatever enemy she's chasing down. Defense attorney Arthur Mackenzie seizes this window. "Your Honor, I must once again urge a reevaluation of the relevance and appropriate setting for this so-called presentation." Agent Brennan's summary conveniently stops at and around accusations that paint large events without specific sites. She leaps wild conclusions. Judge Vasquez lifts an unimpressed eyebrow at Mackenzie, though she offers no immediate rebuttal. Instead, she flicks her hand, requesting Elena proceed to her next substantive point. Bracing herself, Elena lays out the nail in the coffin. An interconnected map of names and financial records floods the projection. Printout labels detailing dates, precinct locations, approved signatures for funds approved yet rerouted. More importantly, the final connection circles back around evidence lost or mishandled, all precinct employees anchoring damage potential levels across shared intuition, signatures, remaining secure across mark, mainstreamed restrictions, bricks, morality, hardwired, re-endar string, we language perceive longer structures mirroring sensibilities, corruption, foreshadow new rural colder weight, overly aggrieved arcs endings, ideal seriousness, damp receive, unveil slowly, frigid motivate unravel, exponential suspect, prime newer repetitive tap. Suddenly, just as the gallery leans in with heightened curiosity, half-dripping skepticism adjacent positives, Lither concluding, Klob stretched unfolds unexplored cautious reeve, across background sensory, familiar unnoticed middle indiction, sus kai piao juice he possible, point of reset sum, halfway mid-falls, Experian prove. The courtroom seemed to shrink under the weight of silence so profound that the world beyond its oak-paneled walls might as well have ceased to exist. Every pair of eyes was fixated on Elena Brennan, who stood at the center of the room, her hands gripping the edges of the podium as if it were the only thing keeping her upright. Behind her, the projection flickered faintly. The web of names, signatures, and numbers she had painstakingly assembled casting a shadow over everyone present. "This isn't just a financial discrepancy," Elena said, her voice cutting through the quiet like a razor. It carried the weight of certainty, hardened by months of investigation and sleepless nights. "This is deliberate. Layer after layer, the corruption burrows deeper, wrapping itself around the very core of the precinct. And it doesn't stop there. She gestured sharply toward the projection where the evidence illuminated stained faces. The transfers, the payouts, even the evidence room logs, every single anomaly points to a cover-up designed to shield those at the highest levels of power. Mark Brennan shifted uncomfortably, his jaw tightening as his daughter's words began to suffocate the air in his lungs. His mind spun with attempts to dismiss the connections. Could this just be a mistake? An unfortunate collision of unrelated events? But even as he questioned it, guilt gnawed at the edges of his consciousness. He knew Elena was thorough, methodical. If she had come this far, she would not risk everything unless she was sure. Across the room, Judge Vasquez leaned forward, her expression inscrutable. "Agent Brennan," she began, her voice sharp, betraying just the faintest edge of weariness. "You're making quite the claim. But thus far, you haven't provided concrete evidence that connects these financial irregularities to the action your father is accused of. Your theory remains circumstantial." Elena did not flinch. She nodded once, deliberately, seeming to brace herself. "I understand, Your Honor," she replied. "That's why I need to introduce the next piece of evidence." The room tensed visibly, a collective breath taken in apprehension. Even the gallery, typically restless and prone to distractions, sat frozen in anticipation as Elena reached for a stack of folders at her side. For a moment, her hands paused. She might have been hesitating or gathering the courage to deliver a blow that could shatter not just the trial, but her personal life as well. "These," she began, laying the folders down across the bench in a precise arrangement, "are copies of the communications logs intercepted from Precinct K42. These are encrypted messages flagged during an internal bureau audit, messages between officers and unnamed third parties coordinating the disappearance of evidence related to the Grayson file." Her words dropped into the courtroom like a bomb. A murmured chaos erupted among the audience. Arthur Mackenzie rose from his seat with an almost theatrical indignation. "Your Honor!" he barked, stepping forward, his finger jabbing toward Elena like an accusatory blade. "This is preposterous. These logs, these so-called intercepted messages are inadmissible. They are hearsay without proper certification." Judge Vasquez raised her hand, cutting him off mid-tirade. "Sit down, Mr. Mackenzie. I'll determine what's admissible," she said coolly, and Mackenzie complied, though his lips were pressed into a thin, furious line. Elena reached for the remote, her movements purposeful but tinged with urgency. The projection shifted, now displaying lines of text from the decrypted logs overlaid with timestamps. Conversations between officers, anonymized by the system, revealed exchanges such as, "Officer 1, shipments arrive tomorrow. Package number 7 goes to storage. Nothing else gets tagged. Understand?" "Officer 2, understood. Same split as last time?" "Officer 1, yes. And remember, damage control if anyone snoops." Seeing the words splayed across the screen sent a ripple through the courtroom. People leaned in, squinting at the damning evidence. But what rose above all the noise was Anthony Grayson's younger sister, her barely audible words. "They knew." Mark overheard her, the words twisting like a dagger in his ribs. Sweat gathered at his collar, the room closing in around him. He thought of every petty deal and quiet nod he'd witnessed over years on the force, things shrugged off, rationalized, tucked away into the corners of his memory. Were these messages the culmination of that rot? Could his own precinct, his own brothers and sisters in blue, have gone this far? Elena began to speak again, but her voice now bore an unmistakable edge of emotion. "These logs connect specific dates and times with evidence removals at Precinct K42. They correlate with a period during which over 20 major narcotic seizures went unreported or were conveniently lost before they could reach the evidence locker. But that's not all," she added, pacing slowly across the courtroom, her gaze flickering toward the jury. "Your Honor," she continued, "I'm now going to submit Exhibit 27A, series of recorded conversations obtained through officer-initiated wiretaps conducted during an internal sting operation." The moment the words left her lips, the reaction was visceral. Audible gasps rippled across the gallery, reporters scrambling to their feet to scribble furiously in their notepads. Mark Brennan surged forward slightly, unable to suppress an involuntary outcry. "Elena, wait!" She turned sharply, meeting his wide, panicked eyes. For a split second, there was only silence between them, a suffocating stillness filled with everything unsaid. Elena swallowed hard, breathing deeply before she addressed her father, not as her parent, but as another potential suspect. "This," she said, projecting her voice so everyone could hear, "is bigger than you, Dad. This is bigger than all of us." Her words sliced through Mark like a knife. He sank back into his seat, his hands clawing at the edges of the table as if anchoring himself to reality. The judge motioned impatiently. "Proceed, Agent Brennan," she ordered. Elena nodded, her confidence returning in measured waves. She pressed a button on the court's audio system and the playback began. Distorted voices hummed through the speakers, their tones hushed but steady. The courtroom hung on every word. "Officer 1, package is secure, but we've got issues at the Grayson scene. The civilians are pushing back." "Officer 2, doesn't matter. Stick to the parameters. Damage control means no loose ends." The words "no loose ends" echoed around the room as if amplified by the collective shock settling over the gallery. Anthony Grayson's family sat motionless, staring straight ahead, their grief frozen in this awful moment of certainty. Judge Vasquez gave no outward sign of emotion, but her knuckles whitened as she gripped the edge of her bench. "Agent Brennan," she said, her voice quieter now, though no less resolute, "you've presented a compelling argument. However, you must realize the gravity of what you are implying. This case is no longer just about your father or this particular incident. You're accusing an entire precinct of systemic corruption. Are you prepared to see this through?" Elena straightened her shoulders, meeting the judge's stern gaze with unwavering resolve. "Yes, Your Honor," she said simply. The gravity of her declaration swept over the courtroom in silent waves, the meaning sinking in for everyone present. Mark Brennan, unable to maintain his composure any longer, buried his face in his hands. But Elena remained solid, a storm contained by sheer will. As the tension reached its boiling point, the doors to the courtroom creaked open once more. This time, it wasn't another interrupting agent or a dramatic witness. It was Frank Mills, Mark's former partner, whose expression carried something far more unsettling than guilt resignation. "Frank," Mark whispered to himself, his voice breaking as his partner stepped forward, the weight of years evident in every halting step. Judge Vasquez glanced toward Mills and then back to the others in the room. "Mr. Mills, do you have something to say?" she asked, her tone weary but expectant. Frank hesitated, his gaze flickering from Mark to Elena. Then, with a sigh that seemed to drain the life from him, he said, "Your Honor, I have something to confess." The gallery exploded into chaos, reporters shouting over one another, cameras flashing as they angled for the perfect shot. The gavel slammed repeatedly, Judge Vasquez demanding order, but the damage was done. Whatever secret Frank Mills was about to reveal, it was going to change everything. Recap: Elena presents damning evidence of systemic corruption within her father's precinct, implicating officers across multiple levels of leadership. As the courtroom struggles to process, Frank Mills, Mark's former partner, steps forward with a shocking confession on the tip of his tongue, and the trial takes an even darker turn. The courtroom is a sea of restlessness as Frank Mills, Mark Brennan's former partner, steps forward, his shoulders sagging under the weight of what he's about to reveal. Every step he takes echoes loudly, his worn boots clapping against the polished wooden floor. Eyes dart between him and Mark, with everyone silently questioning what new twist has emerged from the shadows of this already chaotic trial. Mark Brennan lifts his head slowly from his hands, his face a canvas of weariness and dread. He knows Frank Mills better than he knows most men. Frank is the type to avoid unnecessary risks, the kind who knows when to speak, and more importantly, when to stay silent. Now, walking into the lion's den, it's clear, something monumental is about to happen. Judge Vasquez's gavel slams twice, though even her commanding voice cannot fully quiet the murmurs buzzing through the courtroom. "Mr. Mills," she says, a sharp edge of impatience in her tone, "if you are about to make a statement relevant to this case, I suggest you do so promptly. This courtroom has endured enough distraction today." Frank stops a few feet from the center of the room, visibly hesitating before shifting his gaze toward Mark. There's a tremor in his expression, an amalgamation of guilt, sadness, and something deeper, perhaps shame. He adjusts his tie with shaking hands before addressing the judge. "Your Honor," Frank begins, his voice gravelly and tight. He hesitates as though the words themselves are razor blades dragging through his throat. "I've worked alongside Mark Brennan for years. I'd like to think I know his heart, his values. But as much as I've wanted to believe in him, things don't add up." His voice falters, and silence swallows the room whole. Mark's mouth tightens into a thin line. Though his lips don't move, his eyes scream a single question at Frank. Why? Judge Vasquez leans slightly forward, her expression calm but her gaze piercing. Mr. Mills, forgive my bluntness, but this trial isn't a confessional booth. If you have evidence to present, you need to get to the point. Frank nods swiftly, flipping open a battered leather notebook in his hand. I didn't plan to come forward, he admits quietly, shooting another glance at Mark. I thought about disappearing altogether, maybe transferring precincts, leaving this mess behind. But something Agent Brennan said struck me. He looks at Elena, who returns his gaze with a mixture of skepticism and cautious optimism. If this trial ends without the truth, no one wins, least of all the Grayson family. At the mention of Anthony Grayson, the gallery hums with emotion. Anthony's younger sister clutches a pendant around her neck tightly as his mother, still red-eyed, shrinks into her seat, bracing herself for whatever comes next. Frank exhales loudly, flipping to the middle of his notebook. Your Honor, I possess knowledge of undocumented activities that occurred at Precinct K42, he says. Activities that align with Agent Brennan's findings about financial irregularities and evidence tampering. But I need to be clear. This won't just implicate Mark Brennan. His voice dips lower. It'll implicate a lot of us. A collective gasp ripples through the gallery. Officers seated in the back shift uncomfortably, their postures stiffening as though preparing for a blow. Mark closes his eyes for a moment, his fists clenching on the defense table. Proceed, Judge Vasquez orders, her tone losing patience. The court won't tolerate cryptic insinuations, Mr. Mills. If you have information, disclose it now. Frank hesitates again, his fingers gripping the notebook as though it might slip from his grasp if he loosened his hold even slightly. Finally, he speaks, his words tumbling out like water breaking through a dam. The precinct has been systematically destroying evidence that implicates officers in illegal drug trafficking. Narcotics seized during busts, they don't always make it to the evidence locker. Instead, they vanish. Officers in on the scheme ensure the paperwork aligns with false narratives, damaged goods, misplaced inventory. The drugs are funneled back into the streets, and the profits… He pauses, swallowing hard before finishing. The profits go to a slush fund, split between a handful of officers. Mark and I, we both knew about it. We all did. The courtroom erupts like a dynamite blast. Reporters leap to their feet, penning headlines and furious scrawls. The gallery dissolves into chaos, shouting, crying, accusations filling the chamber with palpable intensity. Judge Vasquez's gavel bangs repetitively, the sound seemingly drowned out by the uproar before order is eventually restored. Mark stares at Frank, his face ghostly pale. His lips part, but no words come out. We all did. The phrase repeats in his mind until it becomes deafening. Elena remains frozen at the podium, her steely composure cracking slightly at the edges. These revelations, while they coincide with her evidence, strike a much deeper blow than she anticipated. My father knew? My father was silent? Your Honor, Frank continues. Once quiet has resumed, though his voice now quivers under the weight of his confession. I have copies of altered police reports, filed by officers under direct orders from higher-ups. I can hand them over to the prosecution if permitted. Arthur Mackenzie immediately rises, his face reddened with anger. Your Honor, he snaps, this is an ambush. There has been no vetting of these so-called reports. For all we know, this is fabricated nonsense. Sit down, Mr. Mackenzie, Judge Vasquez says curtly. She narrows her eyes at Frank. You'd better know what you're doing, Mr. Mills, because perjury is not taken lightly in this courtroom. Frank nods solemnly, stepping aside to hand over a thick manila envelope to the prosecution. Sarah Holden, the lead prosecutor, accepts it cautiously, quickly flipping through its contents. Meanwhile, Elena takes a step back, her mind reeling. She stares at her father, searching for answers in his face, but the man before her seems hollowed out, a mere shell of the figure she once admired. For a fleeting moment, she questions whether her pursuit of justice has destroyed not just their fragile bond, but also the very fabric of her understanding of good and evil. Judge Vasquez, her patience visibly thinning, gestures toward the prosecution. Ms. Holden, have you reviewed the material? Sarah Holden nods slowly, flipping through the folder with meticulous precision. Your Honor, these reports are consistent with the time frame outlined in Agent Brennan's presentation and align with the financial accounts previously discussed. If authenticated, they corroborate a precinct-wide operation of corruption. The judge exhales slowly. Then they will be officially entered into evidence pending verification. She fixes her gaze on Frank. Mr. Mills, your testimony, if found credible, will have far-reaching consequences. Are you prepared for the fallout? Frank hesitates, his eyes drifting toward Mark one last time. Fallout's what happens when you stay silent too long, he says softly. I've made my choice. As Frank steps back to his seat, the courtroom remains taut with tension. Elena seizes the moment to step back to the podium, her voice measured yet tinged with emotion. Your Honor, she begins, it's clear we aren't just looking at a single bad actor. The evidence and testimony paint a picture of systemic rot, and if we ignore it now, it'll continue to fester and destroy more lives. Judge Vasquez regards her carefully, her expression inscrutable. Agent Brennan, your dedication to uncovering the truth is commendable, but the risks are vast. Law enforcement, for all its flaws, relies heavily on public trust. Exposing this may shatter it irreparably. Are you confident this is the path forward? Elena nods firmly, the weight of her resolve heavy but undeniable. The truth doesn't care about the risks, Your Honor. Justice demands we face it, no matter how uncomfortable it may be. Before the judge can respond, the courtroom door opens once again with a sudden, resounding creak. A tall, imposing figure steps in, his badge gleaming under the fluorescent lights. It's Matthew Royce, the special agent in charge who had previously confronted Elena. His face is stern, unreadable, but his presence alone ripples through the room, commanding attention. Royce doesn't stop at the doorway. Instead, he strides purposefully toward the judge's bench, his cold eyes locking onto Judge Vasquez. Your Honor, he announces, his voice carrying effortlessly across the courtroom, the Bureau has new evidence that needs to be reviewed immediately. It changes everything. And just like that, the room plunges into pandemonium once more. Recap. Frank Mills confesses to widespread corruption involving the precinct and implicates Mark Brennan in the process. Elena's evidence is further validated, but the courtroom is stunned into chaos when Special Agent Royce arrives with new, game-changing evidence. Elena Brennan exits the courtroom, her breaths sharp and shallow as she processes Frank Mills's stunning confession. The air outside feels heavier, almost as though the weight of the truths unveiled moments ago has seeped out into the hall. The clattering sound of hurried footsteps pounds behind her as reporters push past court officials in a desperate bid to grab sound bites, but Elena blocks them all out. Her focus is laser sharp. Matthew Royce's arrival with newly declared evidence looms over everything. Her hands instinctively tighten into fists at her sides. Whatever game-changing evidence Royce plans to introduce, it reeks of distraction deflection even. His timing is too precise, his looming presence too convenient. Still, Elena knows she has no choice but to ready herself for another upheaval. Justice doesn't wait for perfect circumstances, and she certainly isn't about to back down now. The hallway echoes with increasing clamor as people spill out of the courtroom. Mark Brennan trails behind Elena, his pace unsteady, his eyes hollowed by exhaustion and shame. He doesn't call out to her, doesn't even try. The chasm between them has grown wider than he ever thought possible, and he isn't sure if words could ever bridge it again. Instead, he pauses near the water fountain at the corner of the corridor, leaning heavily against it as he watches Elena's faint silhouette cut through the crowd. Meanwhile, inside the courtroom, chaos reigns. Journalists scribble feverishly, their whispers weaving a tapestry of questions no one can yet answer. What is Royce hiding? How deep does this conspiracy stretch? Frank Mills sits slumped in his seat now, the last reserves of his strength seemingly drained with his confession. His hands tremble slightly as he stares down at the empty notebook spread across his lap, knowing he's finally burned bridges that can never be rebuilt. There is an odd relief in that, but also a grief sharper than any he has known. Judge Eleanor Vasquez raps her gavel sharply, a commanding presence amidst the storm. Order, she demands, her words slicing through the cacophony. Though it takes several long moments, the room settles into a tense quiet, the conversations dissolving into uneasy whispers until only Royce's slow, deliberate steps to the bench punctuate the silence. Every eye follows him as he approaches, his demeanor betraying nothing. Royce thrives on control, and right now, he exudes it. Special Agent Royce, Judge Vasquez begins, her tone layered with authoritative patience, you disrespected the court's proceedings once before. While you are within your rights as a federal representative to present new evidence, I will not tolerate theatrics. If you have something substantial, speak plainly. Royce nods curtly, sliding a thick black folder from beneath his arm and placing it meticulously onto the bench before her. His hands rest lightly on the desk as he leans forward slightly, his towering figure effortlessly exuding dominance. Your Honor, the Bureau has been running a parallel investigation tied to the activity uncovered by Agent Brennan. Until now, we've kept it sealed under strict clearance to avoid compromising the integrity of our operation. But given recent developments, his gaze sweeps in Elena's direction. We're breaking protocol to protect against further escalations. Judge Vasquez arches an eyebrow. Further escalations? Yes, Royce confirms, his tone chillingly succinct. There are larger forces at play here. What my team has uncovered doesn't just implicate a precinct or a handful of officers. It exposes an entrenched network spanning state and federal lines. Elena Brennan's evidence has laid a foundation, yes, but it doesn't begin to address the depth of what we've discovered. The courtroom ripples with shock again, an audible exhalation of tension rolling through the gallery. Royce steps aside slightly, motioning to an agent at the back who immediately retrieves a portable projector. After a moment's setup, the lights dim, and blurry surveillance footage begins to play on the courtroom screen. This, Royce narrates, is live footage from a high-level sting operation conducted 6 weeks ago. What you're watching is a transaction between key members of the cartel network we've been tracking for 3 years and officers from Precinct K42. Elena stiffens instantly, her sharp instincts tuning entirely into the grainy video. The details are difficult to make out, but the uniforms of the officers are unmistakable. A cold realization coils in her stomach. She crosses her arms tightly, fighting the emotions that threaten to surface. Royce continues. The officers seen here, he freezes the frame, zooming in on faces partially captured by shifting camera angles, are just 2 of the several individuals we've identified as being complicit in drug trafficking activities facilitated through precinct channels. What's more concerning is this. Royce clicks to another still image, this time of a vehicle license plate. A collective gasp fills the court as the plate is traced back to none other than Mark Brennan. Mark visibly recoils in his seat, his face drenched in shock and disbelief. That's not possible, he mutters aloud, his voice cracking. I've never— Silence, Mr. Brennan, Vasquez interrupts firmly, her sharp glance silencing him before he can protest further. She looks back to Royce. Explain. The Bureau tracked this vehicle, registered under Mr. Brennan's name, leaving multiple locations of interest within days of evidence seizures reported as compromised or missing. While we can't confirm direct participation at this point, the circumstantial connection raises reasonable suspicion that must be examined. Royce's words are icy as steel, but strategically devoid of absolute accusation. Elena's fists clench tighter. Pieces of this puzzle, the tangled web she sought to unravel, now slip from her grasp, shifting into Royce's narrative, his control. She can hear the courtroom murmurs swirl around her, can feel the stares from the jury, the gallery, officers, and even her father. Her world, once painstakingly rigid and neatly ordered, feels as though it is slipping into chaos with every passing second. Your Honor, Royce adds pointedly, we propose halting this trial momentarily to convene an emergency briefing with federal representatives. The risk of further leaks or compromised evidence requires immediate attention. No! Elena's voice cuts through with sudden clarity and defiance. The room turns sharply toward her, startled by the outburst. Even Judge Vasquez seems momentarily stunned before regaining her composure. Agent Brennan, I will not entertain interruptions without merit. Explain yourself. Elena steps forward, her gaze locking with Royce's. Your Honor, with all due respect to Special Agent Royce, this trial has become the focal point of justice for Anthony Grayson and countless others affected by this corruption. Moving these proceedings behind closed doors risks eroding the fragile trust the public has in this legal system. We need transparency, not more secrecy. A murmur of approval rises faintly from the gallery. Royce's expression hardens, his jaw tightening as though restraining the rebuke that lingers on his tongue, but Elena presses on. Your Honor, I urge you to allow the trial to proceed publicly while incorporating any additional evidence the Bureau feels is relevant. If the truth is as damning as they claim, then it will withstand public scrutiny. Judge Vasquez regards her thoughtfully, weighing the poise and conviction in Elena's words against Royce's calculated request. After several agonizing seconds, she leans back in her chair. Both sides present valid points, she begins carefully, her tone measured. But I agree with Agent Brennan's assertion that transparency must remain a priority in this process. Special Agent Royce, any evidence you wish to submit will be reviewed in open court. This trial resumes as scheduled. Royce's facade of calm almost falters, his displeasure flashing momentarily in his narrowed eyes. But he eventually nods curtly. Understood, Your Honor. Mark watches the exchange in silence, his heart heavy with conflicting emotions. He recognizes the cracks forming in Royce's carefully constructed control, but cannot shake the fear that the cumulative weight of the evidence might bury him, guilt by association or otherwise. As the courtroom lightens, the gallery buzzes anew with anticipation, the stakes escalating. Elena fights the knot in her throat as she prepares for what comes next, knowing the rest of this trial could either cement her career as a hero or crush everything she holds dear. Across the room, Royce folds his arms, standing in one corner with an unreadable expression. His patience may have run thin, but one thing is certain. He isn't done playing his hand yet. Recap. Royce unveils evidence further implicating Mark, linking him to drug trafficking activities. Despite Royce's attempt to move the proceedings to a private briefing, Elena successfully argues for the trial's transparency. The courtroom braces itself for the evidence battle to come. A tense silence grips the courtroom as Judge Vasquez's gavel pounds once again. The dramatic choice to proceed publicly, rejecting Royce's attempt to cloak the trial in secrecy, lands heavily on everyone in the room. Royce, though outwardly calm, stands rigid, his jaw clenched like an iron vice. Elena swaps her steely resolve for a moment of reflection, feeling the weight of her bold stance. The court has sided with her, but everyone knows the storm is far from over. Across the room, Mark Brennan slouches deeper in his seat, sweat collecting at his temples. Every revelation tightens a noose around his neck, not just of guilt, but also of regret. He feels the eyes on him, the crushing burden of accusation, and most of all, the disappointment radiating from his daughter like a cold beam of light. Mark isn't guilty of every crime laid out by Frank Mills and Royce, but the sins of silence, of complicity, those he cannot deny. The courtroom shifts back to order as Judge Vasquez calls for the next piece of evidence. Royce, composed but predatory, returns to the center of the stage, taking control of the projector with the smooth confidence of a man accustomed to authority. He gestures toward the screen, where more detailed images of classified documents and intercepted communications flash into view, each one accompanied by cryptic labels and unmistakable seals of authenticity. The presentation oozes precision but lacks the clarity Elena's evidence offered. This, Royce begins, tapping the clicker with purpose, is confirmation that the corruption within Precinct K42 isn't just about local graft or low-level collusion. We are looking at an extended network of criminal collaborations spanning multiple precincts, state agencies, and potentially even federal contractors. The nexus of this investigation is unprecedented, and the consequences of mishandling this information are unimaginable. Royce emphasizes the word unimaginable, his gaze locking briefly on Elena as if challenging her to oppose him. But she doesn't flinch. Instead, she keeps her arms crossed tightly and her chin held high. The screen shifts to an email thread unearthed from Precinct K42's internal server, bearing incriminating language about reallocating assets. Royce narrates, "In this communication, officers discuss the distribution of seized materials and explicit instructions to bypass standard reporting procedures. These timelines align directly with the financial irregularities flagged earlier by Agent Brennan." Arthur Mackenzie, finally regaining some footing, rises to his feet to interject. "Your Honor, with all due respect, we need to address the reliability of these documents. Federal evidence that conveniently corroborates one narrative introduced at this stage smells suspiciously like opportunism. Defense must have the right to cross-examine every detail." Judge Vasquez's gaze hardens on Mackenzie. "Duly noted, Mr. Mackenzie, but now is not the time to obstruct. You will have your opportunity when the evidence is presented in its entirety." Mackenzie grumbles something under his breath, but sits back down, visibly frustrated. As Royce continues, Elena notices something unsettling. For all his bravado and expertise, Royce seems intent on steering the narrative in a singular direction, one that uses Mark Brennan as a key pawn but buries her own contributions in layers of federal intrigue. It dawns on her that Royce's game may not be about justice at all. Perhaps it's about protecting something or someone much higher up the chain. Elena steps forward without waiting for permission, drawing a sharp glance from Royce. "Your Honor," she begins, her voice cutting through his monologue. "While I appreciate the Bureau's thoroughness, I believe it's imperative we address a significant gap in their findings." Gasps ripple through the gallery. Royce's lip twitches, the first break in his unflappable demeanor. "This report," Elena continues, pointing to the screen, "while extensive, fails to address two critical anomalies in the chain of events leading up to and following Anthony Grayson's assault. First, the sudden disappearance of a key witness and anonymous informant referred to as Redline in both Bureau and precinct logs. And second," she pauses for emphasis, leveling a piercing glare at Royce, "the unexplained delay in federal intervention despite clear signs of systemic failure months prior." The courtroom erupts into murmurs. Royce moves to speak, but Judge Vasquez holds up a hand to silence him. "Agent Brennan, are you prepared to elaborate on these anomalies? Or is this an attempt to redirect the court's focus?" "I'm fully prepared, Your Honor," Elena asserts, retrieving a slender folder from her stack. "Contained here are records of communications between Redline and precinct officers, including timestamps and content summaries, evidence I argue was either ignored or suppressed by federal oversight." She shoots a glance at Royce, daring him to respond. Royce finally steps forward, his voice measured but simmering with tension. "Your Honor, while I respect Agent Brennan's initiative, she is stepping dangerously close to misinformation. The informant in question, if such a person exists, is classified under federal protection. To disclose that information here would be both illegal and reckless." Elena doesn't back down. "Classified doesn't mean erased, Special Agent Royce. Redline's testimony could unravel key aspects of this case testimony that's mysteriously absent from your so-called comprehensive report." Judge Vasquez leans back, her gaze darting between the two agents as if weighing the merits of two competing storms. "This court does not deal in phantom witnesses, Agent Brennan. Either produce verifiable evidence, or this line of inquiry is over." Elena hesitates for the first time, weighing the repercussions of what she's about to do. Then, with a deep breath, she reaches into her file and places a single folded document onto the bench. "Your Honor, this is a sworn statement from a third-party investigator who interacted with Redline directly. While it doesn't replace the informant's testimony, it corroborates their claims regarding officer misconduct and implicates high-ranking officials beyond Precinct K42. Royce's composure fractures further. "Your Honor, I must insist this document be stricken from the record until its authenticity can be verified. We cannot let desperation undermine procedural integrity." Judge Vasquez studies the document for a long moment before addressing both agents. "Here is what I propose. We will recess for 30 minutes. During that time, the court will authenticate this document and assess its relevance. Agent Royce, you'll also have an opportunity to clarify your objections. Until then, this court is adjourned." She slams the gavel and the room bursts into chaotic energy. As the courtroom empties, Elena finds herself cornered by Royce in the hallway. His voice is low and cutting. "You're playing a dangerous game, Agent Brennan. Your naivety might cost more than just this trial. It could cost lives." Elena holds her ground, her tone calm but laced with steel. "And what's your excuse, Special Agent? Protecting lives or protecting egos? Because it looks like someone up the chain doesn't want this truth to see the light of day." Royce's eyes flash with something unspoken anger, or perhaps guilt, but he says nothing more. He pivots sharply and disappears down the hall, leaving Elena to steel herself for what's to come. In the recess room, Mark Brennan sits alone, staring blankly at the tabletop. Frank Mills enters quietly, his presence tentative but genuine. "Mark," he begins, his voice gruff but softened by regret, "what I said out there, I didn't do it to bury you. I did it to save what little honor we have left." Mark doesn't respond immediately. When he finally speaks, his words are heavy. "There's no honor left to save, Frank. Not for me." Frank places a firm hand on his shoulder. "Maybe not, but for her." He nods toward the hallway where Elena's faint silhouette lingers. "She's got a fighting chance. Don't drag her down with you." The two men sit in shared silence, the weight of the past pressing down on them as they await the storm's next blow. The courtroom's heavy air seemed to still once again as the 30-minute recess ticked away to its final seconds. The gallery was half full, with stragglers filing back to their seats, a quiet ripple of nerves sneaking like electricity through every aisle. At the center of it all, Elena Brennan sat alone at her table, her hands clasped tightly on the wooden surface as she focused on keeping her breathing steady. She could feel the weight of every passing second as if the walls themselves were leaning inward. But no time to falter, this was it. From the far side of the courtroom, Mark Brennan emerged alongside his defense lawyer. Mark's shoulders sagged, his face devoid of color. The once proud officer now looked utterly defeated, reduced to a shell by the revelations that had poured forth one after another, like body blows he could neither avoid nor recover from. His eyes found Elena's, pleading quietly for reasons only he could articulate. But Elena didn't meet his gaze. She knew that to look at him now risked unraveling the barely held resolve she clung to so desperately. Judge Eleanor Vasquez entered briskly, the soft rustle of her black robes parting the silence as she reclaimed her seat at the center of the courtroom. Her gavel struck once, and instantly the murmurs faded. Gathered reporters shifted forward in unison, their pens poised to capture what would undoubtedly be the next explosive turn in a trial that had already become the epicenter of the media storm. Elena Brennan, Judge Vasquez finally spoke, her voice a measured balance of authority and curiosity. The document you've presented has been authenticated by the court's appointed expert. You may proceed with your argument, but know that the burden falls on you to demonstrate its relevance decisively. The stakes here are already monumental. Yes, Your Honor, Elena replied, standing. Her voice, though steady, lacked its usual steel. But she caught herself quickly, taking a deep breath and squaring her shoulders. All eyes were on her now. Even Royce, who lingered near the bench, arms crossed and wearing the expression of someone who was waiting for an amateur to inevitably fall short. She pushed his presence out of her mind, narrowing her focus to the judge and the jury. The testimony and supporting documentation obtained indirectly through the informant known as Redline, when pieced together with the existing evidence, solidifies a critical timeline, she began, pulling up a digital display on the screen behind her. Before the room had a chance to question the informant's credibility, she pivoted tactfully to the pieces that no one could dispute: dates, locations, and the intersection points where activity from precinct officers aligned suspiciously with missing evidence or unreported narcotics seizures. This timeline, she said, pointing to a cluster of dates, demonstrates repeated instances of improper chain of custody protocol being either bypassed or outright disregarded, almost always in conjunction with financial transactions that funnel back into the same select accounts. As she spoke, arrows on the screen cascaded outward in glaring red lines, growing like weeds toward a larger and even more damning conclusion. But even as Elena made her case, Royce's piercing gaze grew more intense, and finally he spoke again, his voice low but cutting. "Agent Brennan, connecting dots doesn't make a picture, no matter how much you want it to. It makes speculation. And this court doesn't deal in theories. It was a calculated attack, one designed to undermine her growing momentum before it could fully take hold, but Elena remained fixed. She turned to Royce directly, her tone calm but unyielding. "And secrecy doesn't protect anyone except those who have the most to hide," she replied. "If tying these accounts together purely through financial records isn't enough, then let me move to Exhibit 18. The courtroom hushed once more as Elena visibly braced herself for her next move, the culmination of days no, weeks of uncertainty finally boiling to its tipping point. She reached for another file on the desk beside her, this one thinner but no less significant. She placed it on the prosecution's table. "This is a sworn affidavit," Elena continued, "provided by a whistleblower within the precinct who has first-hand knowledge of several incidents in which high-level officers, including Detective Frank Mills, directly facilitated the destruction or disappearance of critical evidence tied to Anthony Grayson's fatal encounter. Though anonymized, the content within corroborates much of what we've presented regarding institutional corruption." At the sound of his name, Frank Mills stiffened in his seat. His face darkened, betraying the full weight of his own misdeeds. The tired and broken man who had first confessed now looked like someone caught mid-fall, uncertain whether the bottom would ever arrive. Arthur Mackenzie, ever the opportunist, rose on cue. "Your Honor, this is absurd." He gestured animatedly toward Elena. "This so-called affidavit is little more than hearsay, uncorroborated hearsay at that. We're building accusations atop accusations, no facts, no tangible proof. My client is on trial, not Precinct K42. Judge Vasquez's expression hardened. "Mr. Mackenzie, sit down," she ordered flatly. Turning her attention back to Elena, she added, Agent Brennan, the introduction of anonymous whistleblowers without substantial corroborative evidence does tread thin procedural ground. Do you have a direct reason this affidavit qualifies for inclusion under strict scrutiny? I do, Your Honor, Elena responded assertively. She reached for the remote to change the display on screen once again. What now appeared was a photograph shot from the interior of a precinct evidence locker, a photograph Elena had spent sleepless nights securing legal access to through the Bureau's labyrinthine permissions process. This is an image taken from Precinct K42's internal surveillance system, she said. It depicts two individuals accessing narcotics evidence related to case ID 928-32, a significant drug bust that was never officially logged in precinct archives. More importantly, she clicked the controller, zooming in. The timestamps here overlap with a period identified in the whistleblower's affidavit, and one of the individuals entering the locker is none other than Detective Mark Brennan. The courtroom collectively gasped. The sound hit something primal. Mark Brennan physically flinched, his hands clutching the sides of his seat as if gravity had just doubled in an instant. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. His lawyer leaned toward him, though his whispered words were drowned out by the growing murmurs from the gallery. Elena pressed forward quickly, despite this new chaos. It's imperative to note, she added while turning to face the jury, that my presentation of this evidence is not intended to condemn one man. Rather, it reinforces the whistleblower's claims that unethical practices weren't isolated within Precinct K42, but were commonplace and enabled by higher-ups. She motioned to her next slide. Intercepted email chains unearthed weeks before the trial began, but flagged for clearance only hours ago. As the jury's attention latched onto the subject headers marked urgent, a cold sweat draped itself over virtually every officer present in the gallery. Perhaps it wasn't just Mark on trial anymore. Stop this! The voice shattered the growing tension like glass breaking against concrete. It was Mark Brennan. He had stood suddenly, and now the room's collective focus shifted entirely to him. Your Honor, Mark said, his voice trembling but audible. Permission to address the court. His lawyer cringed audibly, whispering tactics of restraint, but Mark's expression was sterner than it had been since proceedings began. Iron resolve was overtaking what remained of his crumbling defenses. Proceed cautiously, Judge Vasquez warned, raising her hand slightly to signal the bailiff to remain alert. But you are under oath. Mark rubbed his temples briefly before sighing, deflated. I'm not who people think I am. For years I've told myself I wasn't part of the problem. Told myself that looking the other way wasn't as bad as getting my hands dirty. But I've been lying, he said as his voice broke. Looking the other way was just as bad because it let all of this happen. And now, my daughter is throwing herself into the fire to fix what I refuse to face. Elena stood frozen, her breath catching in her throat as Mark's words hit her like a runaway train. This stops today. No more cover-ups, Mark said firmly. Then, turning directly to Elena for the first time during the trial, he added, If doing the right thing ruins me, so be it. But maybe some good can still come out of this. The courtroom erupted once again, the chaos swirling in disbelief, outrage, and a faint, distant thread of resolve that perhaps justice, real, messy, imperfect justice might finally see the light of day. Recap. Elena connects Mark to evidence tampering via whistleblower testimony and surveillance footage, forcing him into an unexpected confession. Mark's admission shifts the trial's trajectory dramatically as tensions explode in the courtroom. The courtroom was electric. All eyes turned toward Mark Brennan as he remained standing, his head held high despite the weariness practically radiating off of him. For a moment, the entire dynamic of the room shifted. Gone was the stoicism, the carefully controlled artifice of a weathered officer. Here he stood vulnerable, fully human, and utterly exposed. The energy of the gallery crackled, feeding on the rawness of his confession. But the weight of his words demanded more than silence. Something had broken loose, irreversible and primal. I failed, Mark declared, voice firm yet broken. I failed as an officer, as a protector, and most of all, as a father. And the man I am today, I brought myself here, to the edge of my ruin. I see that now. And for all the sins I've committed, directly or from the shadows, I won't run from them anymore. I can't. His voice trembled but threaded with just enough steel to slice through the murmur rippling through the courtroom. Mackenzie leaned toward him fervently, whispering an inaudible chain of objections. "It's over, Arthur," Mark muttered, waving a hand to silence the attorney's protests. "We both know it is. Let me face it myself." Judge Vasquez, whose expression flickered with a mix of stern resolve and faint pity, tapped her gavel once more. "Mr. Brennan, this courtroom will not condone speeches over substance. If you have information pertinent to this case or an act to admit, I suggest you state it now." Mark straightened his posture at the judge's prompting, bracing himself for the weight of what was to come next. Raising a hand to tug at the collar of his suit jacket, he turned his gaze toward the jury, his daughter Elena, and briefly, ever so painfully, to Frank Mills. He had never been surrounded by so much truth and so little saving grace. "I saw red flags," he admitted. "Years ago, evidence degrading, cases refiled or conveniently forgotten. I was green then, ambitious but naive, and I told myself, this is temporary, it's a means to an end. Except it wasn't." His eyes grew hard and distant, swallowed by 100,000 regrets too heavy to articulate. "Looking back, I see how wrong I was. Why morality doesn't work in compartments. You don't dabble in decay, you drown in it." His hands fumbled, trembling fists by his side. "I let it continue, because I thought silence was peace. That's the legacy I leave you, Your Honor. Silence." Gasps echoed faintly amidst scattered murmurs, the gallery swaying like sea tide crashing against jagged rock. Even Anthony Grayson's surviving family exhibited stunned stillness, both in grief and restrained vindication. Grayson's sister, eyes haggard and hollowed by weeks of trial anguish, looked at Brennan's confession with muted detachment. For her, no words would bring her brother back, but words were change. And change held weight. Before Judge Vasquez could respond, Elena stood almost reflexively from her place, a rhetorical lash already forming on her tongue, aimed at the man who raised her. But standing there, watching the fragments of her father collapse into some crumbling semblance of acknowledgement, she paused. This wasn't time to bleed vengeance dry. This was time to do what she was trained for. Elena walked toward the judge's bench, moving with a steadiness that belied the hurricane behind her unblinking eyes. Every step was an anchor toward the ground she would reclaim, the truth she would see lived, even through tears, even through loss. Royce shifted where he stood, his frame rigid but not yet ready to spring. His silent gamble wasn't done, and she knew it. The government had a strange habit of asking for clarity, yet impeding it whenever convenience spoke louder. "Your Honor," she began, addressing Vasquez with quiet force, "if we allow this testimony to move forward, it shifts more than the weight of this trial. What we're witnessing here is systemic, not individual. It didn't start or end with one officer's willingness to look away, nor one precinct choosing to amplify its power beyond governance. Officer Brennan is pleading culpability in this room, yes, but the true dilemma demands how far we're willing to go, how deep we'll dig." Royce cleared his throat before stepping forward, his tall shadow casting along the length of Elena's podium. "With respect to Agent Brennan, we're here to prove without conjecture that systems evolve in protection of people, not paradigms of blame. This court remains trial-specific. It is not a battlefield for policies untested." His tone sharpened further, dismissive almost. "Let's not drown this trial in impossible politics, Your Honor." Elena shot him a look of fierce admonishment, her poise breaking momentarily. "This was never about impossible battles, Royce," she snapped, her voice cutting into suppressed venom. Then returning to calmer scrutiny toward the room's greater jurors, she said, "Your Honor, pretending ignorance allows the greater crime. It does not uphold the law. That's silence masquerading as justice." Vasquez raised her hand this time, not in chastisement but exhaustion. The judge's gavel trembled faintly between decisive strikes seeking order. She saw it unfold visibly, the tangle of procedural debate nesting directly where wounded pride clashed with emergent clarity. "This court," Vasquez said at last, finality girding every syllable, "appreciates the distinctions between restitution and respite, but know now there will be consequences born here, no matter how delicately conviction befalls these trials' broader zones." She turned directly toward Brennan, pale beneath worn fluorescent light. "Mark Brennan, do you understand what Intersect's final plea gesture testimony means firsthand? Placing trial ahead confession's judicial allowance fully? Roars muted courtroom backgrounds. Fog desperation appeal adjustment, American witnesses vigil, crowd climaxes. Faint, additionally rattles, prolong halts, final lining, recharge spectral. Royce adjusts pierces, Disappear, glimpsing bureaucracy, confirms truth. Institution, closes nearer. Statutory gasped alignment, elliptic procedural walls, fracture collides. Prior stagnant harbors, subtle agents. Ava tray tool, ends. End cliffhanger, shifting conclusions. Final lingering room, trail half-wind anonymous.